Portugal v Spain may have felt like two teams perfectly cancelling each other out. But underneath the surface, De La Fuente was slowly putting more and more pressure on one of Portugal's weak spots. We can see at the start of the game how Spain only had one player between the lines, eventually having two players and finishing off the game with three players all in extremely close proximity. So what was the gap De La Fuente spotted, and were his substitutions the main reason why Spain found the winner? In terms of stats, Spain were the dominant team in this game, with more chances created and a higher share of possession. But Portugal did also have their moments that we'll look at later on. What's interesting from this game is that while they both had the same formation, they set up in completely different ways. Spain wanted to create their chances with structured build-up and calculated possession, while Portugal were more intent on defending deep and creating chances on the counter, or going long directly into Ronaldo. With Spain in possession, they would rotate mostly into a 4-3-3, but there were some rotations in midfield that made their shape much more fluid and dynamic. In a position like this, Portugal would defend in a 4-5-1. Ronaldo stayed high on the defensive line and wasn't tasked with helping with the mid-block, but would be ready for any break forward, while the rest of the team attempted to close off the centre and force play out wide. The basic setup would be Olmo and Pedri in these pockets, but very frequently as play shifted to either flank, these players would move over into the same half of the pitch, creating an overload in midfield. For example, if they did this to the right, then they'd have 5 players in close proximity, while on the opposite flank, Baena could move inside and free the flank for Cucurella to overlap. We actually saw this shape in the 7th minute, leading to a huge chance for Spain. They regained possession in midfield, with Pedri and Olmo both on this side of the pitch. This allows Baena to stay more central and gives space out wide for Cucurella to get forward. As they break past the midfield, Olmo is completely free between the lines, and plays a great ball forward into Oyarzabal, who's kept onside by Renato Veiga. But his shot goes wide, and was a huge let-off for Portugal early on. Nonetheless, we can see throughout the first half how these two players would move in unison to the same side of the pitch. And because this would completely overload Portugal's two midfielders, it would force one of the two centre-backs to step forward to close down the player receiving the ball, opening up a gap that Spain wanted to attack all night. And this was an extremely important space for De La Fuente and for Spain, and their tactics were slowly built around trying to find a way of breaking through this position. Crucially, to make this possible, there's a few players that need to work together, and Oyarzabal's positioning was absolutely crucial. Oyarzabal is quite a mobile striker, often drifting from side to side, and his role was to shift between the centre-backs and pin them in place, meaning it would then force the other centre-back to step forward to close down the player in the pocket, allowing Spain to disrupt Portugal's defensive line and open up this space. The problem here, however, was that Spain rarely had enough support ready to immediately threaten this run, and Portugal were able to limit the danger. So Spain continued to struggle to find a way through. On Spain's right, Mendes was doing an excellent job at containing Yamal, and on the left, Neto would drop into the defensive line to form a 5-4-1, and ensure Cucurella couldn't create an overload. And while this meant that Portugal didn't really have much possession, they were still able to carve out some decent opportunities, mostly with Mendes hitting the crossbar from a corner. So going into the second half, it was clear that Spain were going to need some fresh ideas if they really wanted to take advantage of this space that they were creating in Portugal's defensive line. But before we look at that, like many of you, I love travelling for big games. But let's be honest, one of the worst parts of any trip is the chaotic airport terminal. And for the longest time, I thought that airport lounges were something that weren't accessible to me, and I thought they were a luxury strictly for people with ultra premium credit cards. But I've recently learned something that makes every trip much more enjoyable, and you can actually purchase a Priority Pass membership directly with no premium credit card required. With Priority Pass, you can travel like a pro. It gives you access to over 1,900 airport lounges and travel experiences worldwide. So whenever you're traveling for sports, business, or just a quick leisure getaway, Priority Pass helps elevate every single journey. You get to escape the terminal crowds and enjoy a much more comfortable airport experience before your flight even takes off. So whether you're heading out to follow your team or traveling to a major tournament, the excitement shouldn't start the moment you reach the stadium. It should start the moment you get to the airport. And Priority Pass really ensures that your trip starts on the right foot, making the whole experience much more enjoyable. So if you're ready to travel like a pro, now is your chance. And you can get 25% off a standard Priority Pass membership. Visit the link in the description down below to learn more about Priority Pass memberships and discover how you can enjoy airport lounge access with absolutely no premium credit card required. Thank you to Priority Pass for sponsoring this video. So going into the second half, Spain were going to need some fresh ideas to break down Portugal. But we didn't see any tactical changes until the first hydration break. The only advantage for Spain at this point was Nuno Mendes getting injured and being replaced by Semedo. But regardless, Portugal was still able to keep Yamal quiet on the right flank. So after the hydration break, we saw some changes from both teams, with Dalot and Leao coming on for Portugal and Ferran Torres coming on for Spain. And for Portugal, this felt like a somewhat positive change in attack. And Leao gave them a little bit more of an option on the left flank and was able to dribble past the fullback on a couple of occasions. But it was from Spain where we started to see a bigger shift in tactical setup. While Baena would at times drift inside and free the flank for Cucurella, he would still mostly be hugging the touchline, and Cucurella would join the attack later on in the move. But Ferran Torres was deployed essentially as an extra attacking midfielder. He rarely, if ever, went out wide on the left, and the whole flank was free for Cucurella. This gave Spain another option between the lines, and started to up the pressure on the key space we saw earlier. We see this immediately after he was introduced in this move here, with Ferran, Pedri and Olmo all between the lines. In this case, Ferran Torres has dragged Dalot into midfield, and Pedri is dragging Renato Vega forward as well, once again opening up these gaps that we saw they wanted to attack in the first half. Firstly, Olmo attempts to break into this space, but Pedri doesn't make the pass. Then, as Spain circulate possession, this gap opens up once again, this time for Ferran Torres to attack, but the ball is just slightly too long. So it was clear that Spain wanted to double down on this idea of creating overloads right through the middle, to force one of the centre-backs to step out of position. As we can see here with 6 players all in close proximity on the right. This gap was becoming a bit of a problem for Portugal. Moments later, this time with Oyarzabal picking up the ball on the right, dragging Vega forward and then finding Olmo in this pocket of space, but is denied by a brilliant block from Ruben Dias. So finally, De La Fuente just needed one more player to solve the puzzle, and went for a very offensive substitution by removing Pedri and putting on Fabian Ruiz, and Merino on alongside Oyarzabal in the place of Olmo. This completely changed Spain's shape. While at the start of the match we saw 1 or 2 players between the lines, with Torres and Merino they would end up with at least 3 and sometimes 4 players all in a central position, attempting to drag Portugal's centre-backs out of position, creating this big overload in the centre of the pitch, and made it extremely difficult for Portugal to get any control on this game. This is clear in the momentum graph as well, essentially showing that from the introduction of Ferran Torres, Portugal could no longer create any meaningful attacks. And just 6 minutes after his introduction, this is exactly what led to Spain's goal. They play a quick free kick, and Rodri plays it forward into Ferran Torres. And again, because of this cluster in front of the defensive line, it forces Diaz forward, freeing up the perfect pocket of space for Merino to attack, who finishes the move perfectly in the bottom left corner and sends Spain through. Ultimately, Spain were the better team in this game and did create more opportunities, so it's fair that they made it through to the next round. But personally, I still feel like there's something missing from this Spanish team, and they look slightly less worrying than they did at the Euros a couple years ago. But is this just my opinion, or do you feel the same? And if you do agree, then what do you think is the main issue? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.